You want me to
And
read?
yes, I think you're up for reading, and we're in chapter 18. And Paul is on his way to Corinth. Did you bring a commentary?
Yeah.
Well, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about anything.
Do that.
Is that like Cliff Notes?
Yeah.
It's just called Journey Through Acts.
But Dennis, keep in mind that I have seminary training and 50 years as a pastor. So if you want to correct me, feel free. We'll call down the fire and brimstone on you when you get to your car in the parking lot. Does nobody park close to Dennis?
I did. Don't do it
Okay. All right.
Ready?
Yes.
Okay.
You need to turn the camera around.
No.
No, I don't need to be on camera.
You should have that option.
Yeah. But I need to be on camera.
Yeah, you be on camera and I'll hide in the corner, okay? After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently came from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the
Well,
word.
let me stop you for just a minute. Not the name of the nut. Macedonia. Not.
Oh, why not add a nut? Okay, Macedonia.
You said macadamia, and I thought, well, that's nuts.
Are you sure they weren't nuts at
Well,
the time?
I'm sure the audience likes those kind of jokes.
Well, okay. Are we ready to go
yes,
again?
go.
Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed him, well, anyway, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles."
Okay, let's pause there for a minute, because there are a couple things right off the bat we ought to take a look at. One, when Aquila and Priscilla said they came from Italy because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. For a long time, Jews were allowed in Rome, but Claudius was a bit of a tyrant, and so he was trying to drive the Jews out. And Paul went and stayed with them because they were all tent makers and leather workers. And then he would still go to, on Sundays, on the Sabbath, he would go to the synagogue and try to persuade the Jews. Now, here's where something interesting happens. It says, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. That says he stopped working.
No more tents for a while.
Yeah, and why was he able to do that?
Because Silas and Timothy
Still on the
Silas and Timothy probably brought him money. They were, they were helping to underwrite his ministry. So, it doesn't say that, but we can assume that because once those two guys arrived, he stopped just going on the Sabbath and really put his all of his efforts into preaching. Now, people got opposed to Paul, and he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent of it." The shaking out his clothes, is that referred, do you think, to any other time?
Yeah, I don't know where it's at, but somebody was leaving a house and he tapped his feet to knock the dust off, so he wasn't taking what was in the house with him.
Right.
It was a form of saying, I'm not doing this.
Yes.
It was a form of, it's a word,
Well,
Rejection.
rejection.
yeah, and it's kind of what the Italians would say, you know.
How many years did Paul preach? How many years was he used in ministry, give or take, after the thought? Any thoughts or feelings?
I'd have to guess. I mean, it just seems like it went on forever.
Well, he was in Acts 19. That was almost 20 years after
Mhm.
Pentecost. He didn't come along too far after Pentecost, did he?
Not at all. I mean, he was just probably a year or two after
So
Pentecost.
he might have had 20 years.
Well, I'm sure he had at least that, because he's traveling
On the
all
road
over.
all the time.
Yeah. I mean, he was on the road more than,
Willie Nelson.
no, it was was it not Walter Cronkite? Who was the guy that used to do the news?
Charles Carroll.
Yeah, Charles Kuralt. He was on the road more than Charles Kuralt.
I wish we still had Charles.
Yeah. But remember when Jesus sent out his disciples, he said,
Yes.
if you're not received, shake the dust from your clothes and move
Not
on.
necessarily in their house.
Right. Just, as you're leaving town, shake the dust off your clothes and move on. And so, here Paul is doing what Jesus told his disciples to do. And I question whether or not Paul, who always claimed to be a disciple or an apostle, not by living with Christ like the other apostles did, but an apostle called on the road to Damascus, that maybe when Luke writes this story, he's trying to make that connection between Paul, because it was the other disciples who were told, shake the dust from your clothes. If they're not buying your story, don't try to beat it in their heads, just shake the dust from your clothes and move on. So, but Paul adds to it, your blood be on your own heads. And then he says, I will now go to the Gentiles. So, but we don't know, again, there were Gentiles who were Jewish. Some of the early Gentiles were converted to Judaism, and then Paul converted them to Christianity. So, he's not saying I'm done completely with
He
Jews.
was called an apostle to the Gentiles, wasn't he?
Well, that's what we usually refer to him as.
That was the divorce right there.
Yeah. This is the point at which he said, my ministry now is being more clearly defined for me. Because every time he hit town, where would he go? Synagogue.
Right.
So, okay.
Are we ready?
Yes, verse 7.
Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus. Titus?
Titus Justice.
Okay, Titus Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue.
Crispus.
Christmas?
Crispus.
Crispus. I'd pronounce it Cyprus, but Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking, and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. And he settled there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But while Gallio was
Gallio,
was proconsul
proconsul.
of Achaia.
Okay, but while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia,
Yeah.
the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, "This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names and your own law, look after it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters." And he drove them away from the judgment seat. And they all took hold of
Sosthenes.
Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria.
Okay, let's pause there, because
Okay.
now it says there where she started reading, Paul stayed in Corinth for some time, and it said up earlier in the earlier verses that Paul stayed for a year and a half, verse 11. So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the Word of God. So now, why Corinth? Corinth was an important city. It was a harbor town, and it was sort of that fulcrum between Western Rome and Eastern Rome. So it was kind of right there, and it was a port. So there were a lot of people who would come in there on ships and traders. The other thing that Corinth had was they had a series of games called the Isthmian Games.
Oh, that's a big word.
Isthmian. The Isthmian Games.
Isthmian games. Isthmian games.
They had some games there.
Yeah.
This is and had it every 2 years. So it's kind of like the Olympics, and people would all come for those games.
They all ran around naked.
Yeah. But for Paul, when people got there, they had the same problem that we have here in Hutch when they have the tournament. There are not enough hotel rooms.
Oh.
So what would they do? They'd buy a tent. So, Paul was a tent maker. He also had Priscilla and Aquila making tents. And so he probably stayed there for a couple of years because he could make a living.
Good business.
Yes, and he had people coming in.
Sure.
Rather than Paul going out to all these places, they're every 2 years, they're coming to see him. Not see him, but they're coming for the games, and there he is. I mean, that's smart marketing.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to stay here and sleep in my bed every night and still spread the good news. So, and plus it was a port, and so there were other sailors coming in, and it was, on the road to Rome, so people who were traveling by land would come through. So it was kind of an important location for him. And I remember one time when we went through 1 Corinthians, some great stories in there because, Paul is ministering to these people who are living in what would be equivalent to a border town. It was the Wild West. So it had to be a tough job. But
Why in those days we see that Priscilla many times is put first, at least several times. What was going on that would preempt her name? Because that was kind of, as we understand it, is pretty male chauvinist
Right. The commentary says it's probably because she came from a wealthy family.
Okay, she had some power.
Yeah, she had power of the purse.
Okay.
So, you know,
Isn't that interesting?
and it is uncommon that, you know, when you're listing a husband and a wife, that the wife would be listed first. But, you know,
In those days, I wouldn't think so.
pardon?
In those days, I wouldn't think so. And in our day, we've sort of gotten rid of it, but it
Yes.
was always Mr. and Mrs. And you were Mrs. some boy's name.
If anybody's sending Annie and I a card, be sure and put her name first. Sure.
Well, I did a wedding once for a couple that she was a physician and he was in sales of some sort. And, you know, they had this long debate before they got married. How are we going to list it? You know, to Mr. and Doctor. And, you know,
It's really has been rude for decades and
I
centuries.
totally
Yeah.
agree with you. Rude.
What's that?
I thought that's the way it ought to be.
Yeah, well, that's the way we were raised. But like, I remember the Christ Cathedral directory.
mhm.
Now, my mom was a widow. But they listed her as Mrs. Roy Heath. I mean, I thought, she's got a name. And they did it with all the women.
Yeah. Well, we've got a couple at Emmanuel. She has her doctorate and is retired, and her husband is I don't know, you know, what he did, but when they got married, I think it was the second marriage for both of them. When they got married, she didn't take his name.
Oh, yeah.
So when it came time to list him, I remember Pastor Tim said, it's confusing to
Don't know how
list
to
you
do it."
twice, and because two different names, and she said, then list it under my name.
Oh, my,
Yeah.
really?
I mean,
My daughter never had one little thought that she would take any man's name when she got
Mhm.
married.
Charles has got a question.
Okay, you say there are games every 2 years. It sounds like it's kind of like the Roman Coliseum. Is it betting on the players or on the game?
oh yeah, I mean, it was a big deal.
Yeah.
The Invictus Games that Prince Harry, or I don't know if he's called Prince Harry.
Oh, wow.
Whatever
Anyway,
it's
the
called
redheaded,
now.
the redheaded stepson,
Troublemaker.
the troublemaker. He started these Invictus Games, and that's a big deal for
Yeah.
wounded warriors to participate, and that's done every 2 years.
Backing up a bit, verse 9 it says, "One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision." And then in verse 10 it says, he says, "I'm going with you, no one is going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city." You always assume that cities are pretty much without God, but here the Lord says, "I've got many people in this city." So they believe in the Lord. He didn't say they were a bunch of Jews.
Yeah.
Some do and some don't.
Well, they're
Their
Christianity.
minds are open to Christianity.
Yeah, Christianity was really kind of becoming an acceptable religion, and for Rome, there's a term I'll have to come across it here. The Jews, Rome had said Jews are a safe religion. They never felt threatened. Some of the early emperors, but when we get to Claudius, he was a different emperor. And so there was always a question, are these Christians a Jewish sect? Because, we as Christians claim to be part of the Abrahamic family.
Right.
Right.
And we recognize the Old Testament as valid for us. Well, so here you've got this new religion, and Rome wasn't sure how to categorize it.
Upstart.
Yeah. Are these Jewish light? That they're not following the dietary requirements.
Must be some cult.
Yeah. I mean,
Boy, it grew like topsy, didn't it now?
yes.
And we've got a pope and
Yeah.
everything Catholic is Roman.
Yeah. So, you've, and the Mass was done in
Latin.
Latin for years.
So maybe old
1962
Claudius had a point.
or 3, I think, when Vatican II.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I thought it was 65.
Could be, but it was Vatican II.
Yeah. And, I was, go ahead, Chuck.
Finish your thought, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, when I took instructions, I started learning some of the Latin phraseology and only remember Dominus vobiscum,
Which
Big
is,
nose.
the Lord be with you.
Oh.
Et tu cum spiritus tuo.
Is this possibly where some are getting the fact that Paul was called by God to be an apostle of the Gentile? Is this the time and place when he wakes him up in the middle of the night and says, okay, got a new plan?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think people were recognizing Paul as the spokesman for the Christian side of the Judaic
Uh-huh.
history.
It's interesting, you see one door close,
And
and
another
then
one.
you see another one open right away.
That's right.
God opens, says, here's your destiny here.
Yeah. And Paul, the only time he had trouble is when he went back to Jerusalem, because the Jews there,
Makes him sober.
the Jews there were, not that open to Christianity.
Well, they thought that he took Titus into the temple, which he didn't do.
Yeah.
They canned him for it.
Well, it's like anyone who's starting a new organization, somebody's going to find some little complaint to hang a hat on, and then it grows. And, and pretty soon the word would get around, well, Paul's not only eating pork, but he's making all the other people eat pork. And
Well, he
and
could,
shellfish.
as
Yeah.
as he
Being
moves some
It being a pork town.
he's gonna be thought of as overbearing or
Shellfish.
yes,
full of himself.
Yes.
Or something like that. And then people, they kind of back off when you think you're so important.
Paul started really developing quite a following.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of those times when I wish I could go back in history just to hear him talk.
Sometimes he was aggravating people.
Yeah. But, his demeanor was,
Clergy does that sometimes.
he was just a guy who wanted to get the message out.
Yeah.
And he wasn't concerned with some of the other ancillary stuff. Now, I think a lot of times churches have become so structured that we want people to buy into the structure, not buy into what's the meaning behind the structure. That
He's got me writing in paragraphs now, like he does.
yeah,
I'm not so, I said, well, if it's good for Paul, it's good for me. I'm not so worried about having 10 words and a period.
yeah. And his writing and his letters are different than the speeches that we get here in Acts, because he's not writing these speeches. Luke is writing.
Paul is on PBS about once every 10 days. You can watch, I think it's on PBS. If not,
The
it's,
life of Paul.
it's channel 84, whatever movie channel that is.
But it's he had to be a heck of a guy. I mean, because he took a lot of abuse, and he traveled. Now, here he's got 2 years in one spot, and so him to give up 2 years of his ministry for Corinth, obviously he felt he was really reaching more people in Corinth. Plus, it was a seaport town, and he was having more fun in Corinth too.
Surely Paul didn't live in a tent all that time.
No, he was living with Aquilus and
Oh, yeah.
and don't call him Shirley.
I'll try to remember.
It seems kind of funny that they didn't beat up Paul, but then they beat up Sosthenes. Did they just have a lot of anger and picked somebody to beat up?
They had to find someone. Now, Now, remember,
Just had to let them vent their spleen in some way. And having to be Sosthenes.
It just seemed kind of all of a sudden, oh, well, let's beat up this guy. Because God said he was going to protect Paul.
Well, and
Yeah.
is it because Paul was in Roman?
yeah, that could very well be that Paul was a Roman and this other guy wasn't. Because, you know, Roman citizens, that was a hands-off thing. I mean, and that's, in spite of Rome, the
But
message
Galileo
spread
wasn't
because
concerned
it was
about
safe travels on the highways.
Right.
I mean, you know, when you build
Just let
a
'em
road
beat 'em
from Athens to Corinth, somebody's going to use it. And if you can go safely, you know, you look around, you know, today, I don't know how many of you would love to go to New York City and spend a week,
Not me.
but I don't think there are many people who would, because I wouldn't feel safe. I mean, I have faith in the Lord, but the Lord also gave me common sense.
Yeah, right.
So you don't put yourself in a position to get beat up.
Yeah, we test God.
Yeah,
Or even Kansas City right now,
yeah.
I can't expect the Lord.
you know.
Okay, well, let's go on now from 18.
Verse 18.
All right, how do you pronounce Ephesus?
Ephesus.
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 I've been
Okay.
18. She's asking about 19.
Well,
Yeah,
I moved a little ahead.
there.
Okay. Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Caesarea, he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. Then he came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. But taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again, if God wills, he set sail from Ephesus.
Okay, now, remember I've said many times that there's some things in the Bible that defy explanation. In Mark's gospel, it talks about Jesus in the boat, down underneath, taking a nap, and Mark tells us his head was on a pillow. We don't know why his head was on a pillow. I mean,
Because he
Mark.
was a doctor, and it's very important how you sleep.
I'll buy that.
No, never mind. Luke was the doctor.
Yeah,
Sorry.
this is Jesus. He's down below with his head on a pillow. Now, Mark is the shortest gospel. And Mark, if he adds something or includes something, you start thinking, what's with that pillow thing? I mean, there have been a lot of dissertations written on why Jesus was sleeping on a pillow in Mark's gospel, because nobody knows why he's doing that. Well, here's another one. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off
Yeah,
at Caesarea because of a vow he had taken.
what's that?
We don't know what the vow is. We have no idea who the barber was, why he was doing it at this point, and not before he got to
Syncreate.
yeah, but I mean, well, when he was in Corinth.
Maybe he lost a bet on one of the games.
That could be. But here he is getting a haircut.
Well, that's not part of the Jewish
No, no.
They like hair.
Yeah. And the Hasidic rabbi, Jews, the men wear those little spit curls down
Were
the
they trying
side.
to fit in more of the Gentiles with the haircut?
Well,
I think the Jews did have kind of a situation. You took a certain vow for a certain length of time, and then at the end of the vow, you shaved your head and made a sacrifice to finish it off. And I think that's was a Jewish custom.
Well, this commentary spent 5 pages trying to figure out. There are a lot of theories on why. The most common one is that that for Jews, you need to show that you have made a vow that you've made, that it's complete. So you shave off your hair, you get a haircut.
Whether you win or lose?
No, if you haven't
So
stuck
if it
to the
doesn't come
vow,
to pass.
yeah, you have to actually.
Our lady preacher, First Pres, she says she's letting her roots grow till the budget's made. She's so holy.
Now that's
Yeah.
That is good.
I wish I'd thought of it.
One of the things that really hits me is in 21 it says, if God wills.
Yes.
You can tell if God wills in verse 21. It's not just I'll come back, but it's if God wills, I
Yes.
will come back. And I think that's very important that we should put to our lives.
Well, I hear a lot of people say, I'll be back, God willing.
Yeah.
So we can blame God if we don't get back.
We're even told in the Bible, don't give a thought to what you're going to do here. You talk as though you know everything. It's really as God wills it. So
Yes.
He kind
And
of
the
has a
creeks
little
don't
check.
rise.
Yeah, and the creeks don't rise.
But I
Yeah.
say that there's a difference between saying Paul got his hair cut and Paul shaved his head. I can't have a vision of anybody back in those days except monks or something.
Well, monks came a long time later.
Right.
I mean, I don't think there's any way you can.
Shave their head. Shave isn't a good word.
Yeah, I mean, there was no
I mean, they
no
didn't
lady
shave
chick
all.
that you could use.
They must have had a way, because in the Old Testament, when you had a skin disease and the priest determined that you were clean again, you shaved your head and your body, and then you washed, and that made you, then you were pure again, you could go back
Into the temple.
society.
Yeah.
But they knew how to shave somehow.
I just meant the customary thing wasn't shaving your head.
Yeah. Well, I guess I can conclude that I've kept my vow. That's why I'm going bald.
God willing.
Well said.
Yeah. Chuck and Bob,
Yeah.
we've all kept our vows.
Mother
Family
Nature takes
tradition.
care of that.
Now, the term I couldn't find, but here it is, religio licita. RELIGIO. Licita. LICTIA. LICITA. LICITA.
Letitia.
That means it's a religion that is permitted.
Religiosa.
And that's what Judaism was to Rome until Claudius came along. That they never got upset. They never saw that as a threat to the emperor, to Caesar. I mean, it was just, it's exactly what was going on in Jerusalem before we came up on the crucifixion. They didn't care what the Jews were doing. You want to have your Sabbath on Friday, go ahead. And they allowed synagogue. All these towns Paul's going to, synagogues were allowed. If it wasn't an accepted thing, do you think the empire would let them keep those synagogues? No. So it was an approved religion. It was something that,
Well, there
Rome
was
was.
Baal and all that, but I always thought of the Roman emperors as thinking that they were basically God.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I hate to go back, but back on the shaving of the head, most of you others may have this note, but it says this vow Paul took was probably a temporary Nazarite vow that ended with shaving of the head and offering the hair as a sacrifice.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's in the Old Testament in Leviticus, I think, where all
Yeah.
the rules are.
Numbers.
Number 6:18.
But forevermore. Thanks for sharing.
I got that.
To me, that adds another
Yeah.
layer that you
Never heard of
sacrifice.
it.
the-
And shaving your head before setting it on fire would make more sense.
Oh,
Reminds me of lighting a gas stove.
Our Presbyterian friend, what goes on in this Bible
I'm gonna
study, they
sacrifice
probably
my
can
hair to
shut
you,
us
Lord.
down.
Shall we try to finish this chapter?
Yeah, maybe.
I sensed a few rows.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, your eyebrows are going. Come on,
And you smell something.
Okay, read on.
Well, where are we?
I think
22.
22.
When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch. And having spent some time there, he left and passed successively through the Galatian region and
Phrygia.
Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Now a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came from Ephesus, and he was mighty in the scriptures. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being frequent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wanted to go across to Achaia, the brethren encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. And when he had arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. For he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, demonstrating by the scriptures that Jesus was the Christ.
Okay. Remember in it's in one of Paul's letters where he's confronted with people who are saying, I'm Apollos, I'm John's.
Galatians.
Okay, that's right. I got Galatians open. I don't see that passage jumping out at me. But anyway, this explains why that happened. That this Apollos, he was an Egyptian, but he was a Christian. But he knew only the baptism of John, because John the Baptist did have a large following. And some of them were kind of high church John the Baptist people. Some were low church. That's it got close to that microphone.
Oh,
So here
I made him talk.
here we have this Apollos came from Alexandria. Now that's in Egypt, and
He's got a great reputation,
yeah,
and he's doing good. I mean,
Yeah.
he's come a long ways in many years with just the baptism, like having a half tank of gas.
Right.
He's done well.
and he spoke boldly in the synagogues, and Priscilla and Aquila heard him. They invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. So they're saying, you got half the story right. Let me give you the other half of the story. And then when Apollos wanted to go to Arcadia, the brother and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there, welcomed him. And he arrived and was a great help to those who believed, for he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, providing from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. So, Paul is not the only one converting people. Here we have a little story of Apollos. And who came from Egypt. So while Paul is, up here doing ministry to Macedonia and that Syrian area, we got somebody down in Egypt doing the same thing. And, it's interesting what his name is,
Yeah, I didn't.
because that would be the God, one of the,
Don't skip over the information that he received that filled out his understanding. We just did. He said, what baptism do you have? Right? Did we go past that?
It's coming.
How are you baptized then? That's
Oh.
in chapter
Never
19.
mind, are we in 18 now?
Yeah, we're in 18.
We just finished
We're still
18.
18.
It's coming right up.
I apologize.
We're at the end of the hour, so
Coming soon.
that'll be.
So, yeah, we don't want to spoil the surprise for next week.
Back next week.
But it really, it's building.
Well, in 19, there
The
is
Apollo study
another thing
is in
that's going to
1
be
Corinthians.
interesting too.
1 Corinthians?
Verse
Handkerchiefs
12.
and aprons
What
were
I'm
carried
saying is this,
from,
each of you says, I'm with Paul, or I'm with Apollos, or I'm with Cephas, or I'm with Christ.
Yeah. And so, Paul is trying to say, hey, don't attach yourself to one individual, attach yourself to the Lord. And that's one of the things that we still face today in the church. When you listen to some of the preachers, they're saying, you got to listen to me, because I'll tell you what the Lord's talking about. Well,
It's not the way you do it when you get.
Maybe not.
well, yeah. But to be open is not to preach something other than Christ. So, one of my New Testament profs had a scripture on one of the pulpits that he preached at, and he used it when we would have, every seminarian at Virginia at the time had to write our own gospel.
Oh, my.
And he said, what we want is, tell us, sir, of the Christ. And that's what Paul's trying to do. He's trying to tell people of the Christ. And to Apollos and to all the rest, he's saying, don't give us a lot of your beliefs. Tell us about Christ. So, all right.
Did you do good on that? Did you do good?
Oh, yes.
Good.
Yeah. That's a hard thing to do. You sit down and think about it.
Was that your doctorate thesis?
No, that was just a class assignment.
Oh, good man.
Yeah.
I would have dropped out.
Well,
Aren't you glad that
Are you a doctor?
in your era you went to what I would call a real seminary? Aren't you glad that in your era you went to a real seminary,
Yes.
not a weekend warrior thing?
yeah. And Bishop Milliken and I were talking about that last night at dinner, that we just don't have a lot of people in seminary anymore. I
And
mean,
they need clergy, I get that, I would never argue with that.
Thank you.
But I just think it's also much richer if you, and also costs you a lot of money in the old days to go
Yeah.
to seminary.
well, I'll tell you, let me give you my example. I went to seminary, and I did a lot of study since graduating from seminary. But 2 months ago, I found this book.
Yeah.
It wasn't even printed at the time when I was in seminary. And so I'm learning new stuff. And I feel bad for the people who are going to those weekend. I mean, I understand
Sure,
that,
the good part, we get.
yeah, but, even after doing 3 years of seminary, and that was summers and, everything, I still had a lot to learn.
The whole
Well, in
idea.
all these books that amplify the Bible, I just think it's so much better than just taking it blind even if it doesn't make any sense, you just say, well, that's in the Bible, I believe that. Or I don't understand that, but I believe that. Or I would never argue with that because it's in the Bible. But there's so much interpretation that really helps you understand.
Yep.
Well, encouragement is that you don't let the interpretation allure you to the other side, where all of a sudden you're looking back at the Bible as being, well, that's kind of old fashioned. They didn't get the whole picture back then. And that, you gotta keep it on the scale.
And that's the thing I like about this Witherington is he'll go through, like with the issue we were talking about earlier, the haircuts, you know. He goes through 5 pages, you know, here, this guy said this guy said this, and then he draws some conclusions from that. But he lets you know what other people have said. And that's what's most important.
Yeah, I like
That's
that.
nice.
We've kind of gotten away from that in education. The idea of education is to learn how to learn.
Yes,
You know, you're not just stopped with your degree.
that's right.
You learn how to learn, like you say, you know, you pick up other things to expand on that all your life.
Yeah.
I think learning is a lifelong thing. I think,
Oh, yeah.
You know,
But too much
just because you stop
education
school
these
doesn't
days
mean
is
you stop
gone.
learning.
Oh,
What
imagine
the
being
how
a
less
teacher
spread.
Yeah.
for 4th graders. How old, like
All right, my friends,
Every Bible study, I get something.
That's
to
right.
learn.
we'll see you next week, and
Thank
we'll
you.
pick up with chapter 19
Give me a-
and answer Chuck's question.
What important